Hello, this is Amfortas, and the title of this two-part podcast is The Justification for the New Stolen Generation. I dedicate this podcast to my estranged daughter, who I miss so much, and to my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased. Here in part 1, I will discuss how a book written in 1973 lies at the heart of the family court practices and the damage that is being done to our children, to fathers and society, to truth, justice and the family. One of the difficult issues we have in trying to deal with parental disenfranchisement is that few have an adequate explanation for it. To many, it is an issue that they just cannot understand. To others, it barely crosses their mind until it happens to them. When a child is taken away from you, it produces a kind of intense, speechless frustration and despair, a heartbreak, a rage in some, a devastation to so many. A parent cannot retreat away from the sense of blame, of shame, of having shirked responsibility, and a deferral to forces beyond their control. It is disempowering. A few mothers know what this disempowerment feels like. Many, many fathers do. It stems from and produces situations that are complicated and human, while not beyond normal humane resolution. It is the result of handing daily family complexity over to political determination, public policy makers, and inevitably the courts. And the courts do what they always do. They make a decision. You might not like it, but that's what you get. Routinely, in all Anglophile countries, family courts, divorce courts, disenfranchise and dispossess fathers of their children and saddle them with an intense heartache and financial costs, both of which last for years. There is a cost to the children too, the loss of a loving parent and a higher risk to all aspects of their little lives. Of course, were this to happen to a specific ethnic group, such as Aboriginals in Australia, all hell breaks loose. Reports are written and are emotively titled The Stolen Generation. The Chatterati shout loudly about human rights, and the Australian Prime Minister is told to apologise and make recompense. But fathers, who suffer far more from the everyday and far greater stealing of children from them, have no such vocal advocates and no apologies offered. No official authority speaks for them. No one is speaking for the children either. We have a generation of fathers who are shell-shocked and want to know why, in the face of manifest injustice, the courts decide what they do and why so many are complicit in this tragedy. There is a book which goes some way to giving at least a partial explanation. It is a sort of necessary reading, a Bible for the family courts and divorce court judges. It is called The Best Interests of the Child, the Least Detrimental Alternative, written by Goldstein and Freud. It was published in 1973, right at the start of the ubiquitous family court and no-fault divorce era. By the way, that's Anna Freud, daughter of the largely discredited psychoanalyst of the last century. Associated with this book, she adds the cachet of psychological respectability and maternal empathy. It is of interest that the initial part of the title, a very widely used phrase today, comes from Mein Kampf, written by Adolf Hitler, in which he wrote, "People will accept any limitation to their freedom if you tell them that it is in the best interests of the children. Did you know that it came from the National Socialist Adolf Hitler? The blurb on the back of the book asks some questions. What principles should guide the courts in deciding the fate of hundreds of thousands of children involved every year in parental divorces and family breakdowns? What should justify state intrusion on the privacy of family relationships? How should professionals, judges, lawyers, social workers, psychiatrists and psychologists conduct themselves in pursuing the best interests of the children who have been abandoned, neglected and abused? Take note of that last phrase, children who have been abandoned, neglected or abused. And the book is such a justification for the intrusion by the state and more, for cruel and unusual punishment of children and fathers. Over the past 40 years, that punishment has become very usual, and all of society is feeling the pain. The least detrimental alternative in the title at least recognizes that all the alternatives up for discussion are detrimental. But what sort of mind can settle for the least detrimental when positive and helpful alternatives can be found with just a little empathy and compassion and thought? The book is used to guide the conduct of the 70% of divorces initiated unilaterally by women against perfectly innocent loving fathers, where no abuse or neglect or abandonment is a reason. Such circumstances cry out for an empathetic response and some help for families, not a detrimental alternative. It seems to be a manual of sorts, a cookbook, although it repeatedly uses the word guidelines to explain itself. It appears on a variety of reading lists for family court law courses and professionals at large. Indeed, the preface claims, "It would be difficult to imagine an expert working in the field of child custody or family law in the United States or in Canada, England or many other nations, and that includes Australia of course, who has not been influenced by this book." On the back, a professor of psychology at Yale demands, "Without question it should be compulsory reading for judges, lawyers, social workers and clinicians." The American Bar Association's Juvenile and Child Welfare Law Reporter is quoted, "Essential reading for anyone charged with the protection of children in the legal process." So what principles do guide the courts? And what does justify state intrusion, which snatches children from fathers in particular, even where no wrong has been done, no abuse or neglect or abandonment involved? And how do professionals conduct themselves in the pursuit of the best interests of children? These are not normally stupid people. The courts run on principles of law, and the professionals are schooled in ethics. But caution, they are the Frankfurt School ethics, cultural Marxist. They are fallible human beings who have all the usual professional integration issues, which include contending with practical day-to-day income earning that conflicts with an insidious ideology that underpins their education. They are educated in our universities, still reeling from the cultural Marxism onslaught of the 60s, 70s and 80s, and earning a living in a free market environment. This is particularly so for the lawyers, the social workers, psychiatrists and psychologists. Where they must compete for their own small local market share, the more socialist public purse handout money they can get, the better they get on. The effect on these professions, becoming rent-seeking scum, feeding off misery. The more misery they can generate, the more income they get. The judges, of course, have an untouchable public trough salary of epic proportion, all sewn up. Who will fight against a system that pays them $250,000 every year and a fat pension, with absolutely no criticism of how they conduct their office? In fact, no scrutiny. I acknowledge that they are fallible human beings, and they work in an environment where they must follow certain rules to solve difficult personal, sometimes intimate problems. Sometimes the problems are so difficult that they fall back blindly on whatever rules seem to apply, and thoughtful justice dies. They follow certain rules laid down as precedent, both in the court itself and in their professional spheres. But starting from a particularly anti-family Marxist feminist bias, such precedents build to a body of practice that gets more draconian, vicious, anti-family, anti-father, anti-male, and anti-Western society by the day. The problems dealt with by the family court are complex and intimate, and to make matters easier to deal with, such everyday normal legal principles as truth, evidence, and proof are dispensed with, and likely balance of probability used instead. It is a least common denominator approach. Perjury, which is predominantly from the mothers, is ignored as emotion. Prevention of future possible abuse drives a just-in-case punishment attitude, despite no grounds of past or present incidents. False allegations become the tactical devices of combative lawyers. The short review of the book at Amazon.com points out, many conclusions are controversial, but controversy is nipped in the bud by the secrecy rules which do away with the transparency of justice that every other type of court abides by. It is a star chamber. The professionals have their own confidentiality rules that hide their practices too. The argument, as Amazon says, is tight and well presented. One might even say seductive, unless that is you're a parent looking straight down the barrel. Let us look for a moment at the principal author, Anna Freud, a posthumous author. She was Sigmund Freud's youngest daughter. She was apparently his favourite and sought to follow at least partially in his footsteps, but focusing on the psychoanalysis of children. Wikipedia provides an outline of her life and notes that she did not have a very close bond with her mother and had difficulties getting along with her siblings. She suffered from depression and eating disorders. She was extensively psychoanalyzed by her father. The intrusiveness of that and the emotionally conflicting transference and resentment issues should raise a few question marks. She was not exactly what we would call a normal child. Her experience of the average late 20th century family was virtually non-existent. She established and worked at the Hampstead Child Therapy Clinic, which is now named for her. She learned much of the impact of deprivation of parental care on children from young war victims and particularly concentration camp survivors. The children concerned that she had such a reasonable and humane interest in are clearly a far cry from those refugees from the modern divorce industry, and to implicitly treat them as equivalent would be an egregious error. In part 2 of this podcast, I will look more closely at some of the guiding principles advocated by the authors and the sheer bias and twisted thinking that is guiding our family law practitioners. Some explanation and understanding may be had. I end here thanking my good friend Christian J. for his help in presenting this podcast. Thank you for listening.